Hey, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co, and today I'm reviewing Blood from Ludus Magnus Studios. Although more accurately I should say first impressions, because this very much is a prototype, all rules and components subject to change, but there's a lot of things in this game that I don't have full access to, well, how many things would develop. This is a game that can be played several ways. It's a 1 to 4 player kind of dungeon crawl, but almost like a roguelite. You're going to have your characters in the game, you're going to be able to, I believe you can unlock new characters, although I only have the 4 in the prototype over here. There's going to be a few ways to play the game, from single shot to a bit of a campaign mode, to just a degree of progression as you go through sequences of unlocking stuff, powering up your characters, taking on more and more powerful bosses. There are many ways to play through this game, to deal with a variety of locations, but ultimately, again, in the prototype, I only had a little bit of that. So this is going to be very much the first impressions, because I haven't gotten to experience a lot of what you would properly be able to experience if you truly were diving into this game after you backed it, bought it, had it, and went through it. So first impressions, but let's go ahead and dive into that all the same. And I should note, I'll have a link to the crowdfunding campaign down below. There's also a gameplay on the channel, and I should note that is a sponsored gameplay. The review is not sponsored, but obviously if that mishmash or mixing of whatnot is bothersome to you or something that makes this less worthwhile, then by all means I understand and respect that. But with that said, let's go ahead and dive into Blood. This, like I said already, it's a 1 to 4 player semi-dungeon crawler. You're going to be trying to play cards out onto this row over here. What you're going to be doing is this entire board dictates the flow of the game. Or more specifically, there's actually a day phase and a night phase, which is the larger flow of the game. And the day phase is where you're going to be upgrading your characters, gathering new cards, new items, powering them up in a variety of different ways. And then you go into the night phase where you take on the vampire that you happen to be hunting at any given moment. And then depending on which mode you're playing as, you can go through, that roguelite progression, the campaign mode, going through that sequence of powering yourself further and further. The day phase is going to have you dealing with a market board, which I have off to the side over there, but you have a bunch of cards on the market board. You can take certain actions. You can trade in resources that you either start with or have earned through the various progression of the game, and use those to further upgrade your characters. In the night phase, you're going to go ahead and set up a location. Now, part of the day phase will have the ability to possibly choose your location, have a bit more agency over who you're fighting or where you're fighting them. So if you want that sense of choice, you'll have that during the day phase, depending on the actions you take. But in the night phase, you're going to go ahead and face off against whatever you set up over here. You have the Spoils of Evil set up right now. It's going to be a Catacombs. We're facing off against Razvan, and you're going to be taking your characters and facing him off while dealing with various minions who are on the board as well. This board over here is going to dictate that flow. You're going to have certain events in play, a different amount depending on the level of the boss you're fighting off against. You have different events in play. And you're going to be trying to deal with those events, those challenges, which will give you resources towards the next day phase. But then you're going to be playing cards onto this card row, and each card has a threat value. That threat value is going to move this indicator up, and the higher it goes, the more of Razvan's cards are going to enter the board. So the more you do, the more he's doing, which could be a bad thing, but also could be a good thing, because very often the boss's cards will cause a degree of exertion on the boss, making them more vulnerable, which is essential because they are otherwise way too strong to deal wounds to in this game, and you need to take out the boss in order to win. So you're going to be playing cards over here into this row, figuring out which sequence of actions. As you play cards are going to result in him playing his own cards, some of which will break the chain, doing an immediate action, but most of which will have them resolving when you get up to him in the flow, which means there's a degree of deterministic gameplay where you can see where the minions are, how they're going to operate, because their cards are in the flow as well. You're going to see the boss's cards, know how those are going to operate, and you're dealing with all of that, trying to be mindful of what you place and how to set yourself up to avoid all the negative consequences. You never can avoid all of them, to avoid as many of those negative consequences as possible through cleverly playing the right cards and anticipating how the board state will play out, depending on, well, everything. Your cards, their cards, the tests you take, whether you succeed or fail, just trying to set yourself up for success. So the flow is going to be you play your cards, which will determine how many boss cards come out. You then resolve your cards, you resolve Razvan's cards, or whichever boss you're fighting against, and then you go through the minions resolving them as well. And the minions are not always going to be fighting you. Very often they're just getting in your way. Very often they're just something that makes you a little weaker, or sets yourself up that the boss can attack you with his own cards based on your proximity to those minions. So minions might seem threatening, and don't get me wrong, they will deal wounds to you, but they're not necessarily as threatening all that. They're very often a thing that you need to deal with that will get in your way. Sometimes they might be objectives as well, but they definitely are a threat that needs to be managed. When you're done with that, you're going to go through the cleanup phase, and then rinse and repeat until either you lose the game, and they're often the boss cards will have ways that define how you lose, so you need to be mindful of those, and you may not always know what's coming until you play against that boss and start seeing those cards come out and realize what the threat you're facing off against is. But you go through that sequence until you either win or lose the night phase, and then you return back to the day phase and repeat the cycle. That's a very high level of what's going on over here. I'm not going to be diving into a full rules overview, but I will say that if you do want, you can check out the gameplay on the channel, or you can check out other coverage on other channels to get a better sense of how things play, a bit more in detail, how the items work, the cards, the iconography, all of that as you try to figure out how to win in Blood. So with that, let's go ahead and dive into my first impressions of this game. Starting off with what I like, don't like, and can see others not liking, although I should say starting off with ease of play, which is what I usually cover first. And I will say, very heavy disclaimer here, this is a prototype, or not disclaimer, but note, this is a prototype with prototype rules and prototype rules issues. So for me, the ease of play in this game was not easy at all, but it is very much a prototype. I do mention these anyway in these reviews or first impressions, because the last thing I want is the game to come out, have issues with the rules, and be like, why didn't you say anything? I am saying something, but I do think it's just prototype. More often than not, prototype rules are often, well, depending on which prototype you're dealing with, sometimes they look like fully fledged rule books, and other times they are chock full of, a Word document with way too much reference to things and not enough pictures, and this case was definitely the latter. And what makes this harder is this game is incredibly iconography dependent. There's an entire sheet over here of your own, this sheet over here is just full of icons, and imagine the rulebook trying to reference all of those icons, but they don't actually show you a picture of the icon because it's basically a Word document. They just reference the name of a symbol. It made this game a very, very hard game to learn. This is one of the harder games I've had to learn or deal with in a while. I do think that's the combination of being a prototype rulebook as well as being very iconography dependent. Again, I do not anticipate that being an issue in your final copy, or at least very much a lesser issue. Ludus Magnus Studios has put out a lot of games, and their rulebooks have certainly improved and gotten better over time. So there's going to be a lot to pick up here because there are different ways to play the game, different sequences of the game, different things you need to be mindful, the day phase, the night phase, diving into combat, how these boards resolve, and some of these things are not necessarily intuitive to other games you've played in the past, and then there's the variety of the different ways to play the game as well. All of that lends itself to a game that I do think will be a lot to pick up, but I do also think that my experience with it was likely worse. As far as game time, generally, again, I don't know how much longer scenarios might take because I haven't fought against any heavy, level 4 bosses, but in this game, at least the ones I've been playing through, you're looking at around 90 to 120 to go through the cycle, and again, it's not full game, but to go through a sequence of the game is going to be around an hour and a half to 2 hours to play through. I can anticipate longer, heavier bosses taking more time, but at least in this over here so far, that's roughly where we were. Now, as far as what I like, don't like, and conceal as not liking, starting off with what I like, which is to begin with, and this is a Ludus Magnus Studio game, so it's not a surprise, but everything here is absolutely beautiful. The production on this game, from the visual aesthetic of the game, I love the black and white look, and the way that translates over to some of the miniatures, which looks like they're experimenting with some of this acrylic kind of overlay on their minis, which I really like the look, and I think it very much fits into the whole vampire aesthetic of this. So I think the game looks great, which again, their games generally do. They have some of the best miniatures in the board game space, and but not just the miniatures look great. The standees for the scenario elements look great. Even the miniature standees have great art on them. I do believe there'll be an option to get those in a miniature form I don't know if it's going to be separate. I don't know how it's structured. I haven't looked at the campaign page quite yet, although the campaign is currently live. But then in general, everything about the game, from tokens to art to aesthetic, all of that looks absolutely beautiful, although again, I've come to expect that from Ludus Magnus Studios. Their games tend to look amazing. But that's not nearly enough of a reason to get a game, so let's talk about other more meaningful things, starting with the fact that it doesn't outstay its welcome. This game very much feels like you're paced well to get a degree of arc to the game, to enjoy what you're doing, to power up as you go through things, to get a little stronger, set yourself up for success, take down the minions, take down the boss. When I've played through this one over here, this one feels appropriate to the length of the game, which some games don't always feel that way. I think in more recent, some of my reviews, even of games that I've enjoyed, I felt that they overstayed the welcome a bit for what the game was providing, and that's definitely not the case here. I felt it was very well paced, although granted I'm referring to the individual session, not the full game arc, but the individual sessions felt well placed overall. But more importantly, the game has very satisfying gameplay elements to it. The combination of deterministic gameplay plus surprises I found very rewarding. The fact that you can see this entire board, plan around what the enemies are going to do, look at these cards, and I will say, we'll get back into these things I don't like, this is very iconography heavy, and trying to read the cards at first is a lot. It does get better, I still will have complaints, but overall, being able to look at the board and just see what the enemies are doing and plan around them. Oh look, Razvan's going to be moving into the spot with the most of the heroes, so we have to be mindful not to congregate too heavily because we'll get attacked with a bunch of actions while hitting us, so we need to be mindful to spread out. Or maybe we try to wander across the board knowing he's going to charge through the area, but that can help us set off some of our traps. being able to control the board by looking at what's coming your way is a big part of the game and gives you a lot of strategy as you figure out how to lean into your character while managing what your character is doing for the team. Are they setting up the board for a bit more, a bit more of control of the board itself? Are they healing, helping you draw cards? Are they the ones who are just dealing damage? Are they ranged or melee? Leaning into the characters that you're playing as and being mindful of the ability to predict most, not all, but most of what's going to happen really gives you a strong sense of control, and those surprises means you can't rely on that perfectly, which I like, because if you could perfectly rely on things, that would be a little too deterministic. I like the fact that surprises will show up, whether those surprises are cards that come out that have to be resolved right away and you can't plan around them, or whether those surprises are just the fact that you didn't anticipate which tests you're going to fail or succeed, and the new elements those things might add, whether they're the way the boss might react, whether they're minions spawning on the board. You'll frequently have things that didn't go the way you planned on, and you have to adapt and react to all of those as you play through the game. So a good combination of deterministic gameplay as well as surprises mixing things up. I'll say that the progression in the game gives you that sense of building out a character, of making them feel more powerful. Sure, you start off with whatever the game gives you, but being able to build your deck towards your preferences, being able to gather cards that you think works well with the synergy of your own character and or the other characters, being able to tailor things around the characters you're fighting against. Overall, it's a very satisfying combination of deterministic, strategic, surprise gameplay combined with character progression, and the bosses and enemies felt appropriately difficult. This is a game where, when I've played through this, I have not felt that I had a clear win or a clear loss ever. It's always been okay, great, I'm getting enough things done, but am I staying enough ahead of the curve, or will I possibly lose? Like, if you watch the gameplay, I'm not going to tell you which way things go, but you'll see even in the gameplay that was filmed, it also falls into that aspect of being unsure which way things can go. And I don't know how that will, again, progress as characters, as bosses level up, as you're dealing with heavier bosses and going through the full progression of a sequence, but so far I've thought the game was appropriately difficult, giving you a challenge but not feeling completely overwhelming, and overall just a very satisfying gameplay experience. As far as things I don't like in the game, the rules, complexity, multiple ways to play, campaign, progression, tracking, all that things. There's a lot of things going on that will get in the way of making this game an easy game to set up and table. We live in a world full of, well, smaller, easier table games, one-shot heavy Euro experiences, and sometimes these giant, miniature-heavy, boss battler, campaign-driven arcs, and those types of games, that latter section over here, this is what that falls into, because there is single-shot gameplay, but there's also progression-based gameplay, which does give you the reward of building things up over multiple sessions, but also gives you more to manage. The fact that the game has not the easiest rules, and again, I do anticipate that getting better, but still being a lot to do, to absorb, to pick up. The multiple ways to play the game, the tracking your progression of your characters and things over time, does mean this game is going to have things that get in the way of being able to enjoy it frequently and frequently to the best of its potential. So that's something that's going to get a bit in the way. I'll also say that the game is way too iconography intense. There's just way too many icons going on. They very much lean into every single thing being, okay, great, well, each character, range that, test these things, and again, it picks up quicker as you go through it, but this is, once again, the level of iconography you're dealing with. Every single thing has an icon you need to be managed or be aware of, and there's so many different icons in different places, on the cards, on the icons, on the maps, I just said icons on the icons, it's not icons on the icons, we're not yet that far gone, but the game is very iconography intense, and the reason that's more of an issue is because iconography can help make a game more absorbable, but when you're looking at a hand of cards, when you're trying to figure out which card am I going to play now, it's not as easy as simply glancing at a card and seeing, okay, this card is going to do this or that or anything. You're really trying to read through, okay, fine, I'm going to be able to, okay, I spend that, I'm targeting myself, I step 2, then I target the furthest enemy, and I get to do it with a melee attack on that thing. It does get easier as you play through this game, but it is absolutely not easy starting off, and even once you're there, being able to glance at your hand of cards, 2 hands of cards if you're playing 2 characters, while reading the entire board, the idea that is in any way easily absorbable information to be able to strategically make your decisions is not clear. I find that this is a game that you will get better at, and especially once you learn certain characters or minions or the bosses, you will be able to figure out their tempos. Like at this point, I know what Whirlwind of Blood does because I've had this encounter me so many times, so I don't have to guess what it's going to do. But in general, that is going to be a thing that gets in the way of the easy absorption of the strategy. It does get better. Again, I've played through this a few times, so I understand, I've seen those patterns, and it gets easier. But the first time you're looking at the board, you learn what's going on, you're just kind of dealing with one card at a time because there's no way you can really plan against what's happening. I'll say that I felt the game had too much testing. I mean, this is a game that combats are resolved through testing. You're basically testing various attributes. Your characters are going to have 4 attributes, and they're going to roll differently depending on which attribute. And then when enemies attack you, they're rolling against against certain attributes. And sometimes you have a choice of which attribute to roll against, and sometimes those attributes have different thresholds. You have to try to figure out which combination of your dice are better suited for any individual type of test or the attribute that it is testing. And the whole system does work, but it feels needlessly complex on the game. It's an extra level of, hey, you're being attacked physically, so it's going to be one of these top two attributes. You're being attacked mentally, so it's one of those two bottom attributes. You are going to go ahead and get different success aspects. You need 4 successes on this and 5 successes on this, and you're rolling those dice, but you also have a modifier for mental attributes from these cards over here. There's enough things going on that add strategic depth to the decision, such as events that will come into play from the enemies or yourself that will help modify rolls, that I felt that having 4 different types of attributes and often choosing between the two felt like an extra level of what's the right word for it? It gives you the appearance of extra strategy, but it usually just comes down to choosing the optimal thing without giving you a strong, real sense of strategy. So there are times where it can be relevant when you're trying to choose which character is going to deal with what event. There are certainly times where it's beneficial. I think it was an extra level of unnecessariness that gives the appearance of complexity without actually giving any extra level of strategy. So the testing as a general concept I'm fine with. The level of different things you're testing or choices you're making around it just felt like it added downtime and decision space, but not decision space that really had strategic decision space, just processing decision space, if that makes sense. As far as I can see others not liking, there's tons of dice rolling in this game. Now, there is mitigation, there's a lot of mitigation, but you're actually going to be rolling handfuls of dice on a regular basis. That's actually not bad over there, 5 successes. But in general, you're going to be rolling a lot of dice in this game, trying to read the successes, moving up your insanity tracks, which one of the things I do like is whenever you fail a roll, you are moving up tracks. That's another little mitigator you can try to be mindful of to get extra rerolls or successes. But there's a lot of dice rolling. If that's not your jam, the entire game is going to be, I mean, don't get me wrong, there's card play, but everything you do is going to be around dice rolling. So you're like, I attack. How do you resolve the attack? You test your dice and you roll some dice. That one's a much worse roll. But anyways, yeah, there's going to be lots of dice rolling. If that isn't your jam, then this might not be a game for you. As far as final thoughts on Blood, and again, semi-final thoughts, because this is the first impressions, prototype, and all that, I was conflicted on this because there's a lot of things I really enjoy about Blood. There's a lot of things I really, really enjoy. But there are some things that definitely hold back the game for me, and it's ultimately my ratings reflect where I am when I look at the game as a whole, where I am in terms of my desire to play that game, where it fits into my collection. For me, Blood is a 3.5 out of 5, and I felt bad about that one because there's many elements of this game that I do, don't get me wrong, a 3.5 is not a bad rating, it's a good game, I enjoy this game, I'm happy to play the game, but it misses that extra level of, ooh, I really think this is a greater experience. And for me, Blood is on the cusp over there, because I really like a lot of things. I think this whole entire row here, I really like the mechanic. We've seen things like this in general, but the way they did this I thought was very well done. It gives you a lot of deterministic gameplay combined with surprises. The tactics you do on the map and the way you have to navigate around here to set yourself up for success and be mindful of the enemies, I felt a lot of control there. And so I really liked all of that. I like the being able to build and upgrade your characters and the amount of agency and choice you had between your items and your hand of cards. It really felt like there was a lot of positive things happening over here in the game. The things that held it back for me a bit is it's too iconography heavy, and also a big thing, I probably should have touched upon this a bit more in the things I don't like, is the nature of the way the testing goes. It feels a bit too one note. There's not a ton of interesting decisions around how bosses activate. I actually found the minions to be a little more interesting than the bosses, and the way the minions will really trap you in a spot or lower your successes. You have to plan around the minions a lot more versus the bosses. While they are different, there are different bosses in this prototype that are different, because so much of it comes down to just testing an attribute and then taking a wound or not, and they only have minor aspects of how they really manifest differently and feel much more different. A lot of it kind of comes down to a slightly repetitive way the bosses are just forcing you to deal with an attack. So it felt like a lot more of the decision and choices are around how you activate, and it didn't feel like it would be strongly different as far as, different bosses, because of the nature of the system being very iconography dependent. Gives you a little less room for interesting cards that do more fun things. So overall for me right now, there's a lot of things I really like here. I do think this is a game where, depending on how the final game is, depending on what other bosses or things come out, I could see that rating going up, because there is a lot that I enjoy, but there's also some things holding it back at the same time. So for right now, a 3.5 out of 5. Again, lots of elements that I think are stronger than that, but as a whole package, some things pull it back down to that level. As far as other game recommendations, first of all, there's going to be Tanaris Adventures. The game that I think gave me the strongest vibes of the deterministic gameplay and the decisions I'm making, trying to be mindful of dealing with all the enemies while just trying to survive. This game very much gave me those Tanaris Adventures vibes of trying to just balance around so many different things happening, knowing what the enemies can do, but trying to find whatever pathway forward for me that most leads me towards success. And then also, just from a pure pure vibe stance, not really from the gameplay, but from the vibes, I say this does give similar vibes to Grim Coven from Awakened Realms, which I recently just covered. That one's another similar boss battler experience. I thought that the Grim Coven probably had some things that were better, but also ran a little longer. I think overall, I don't know, it's conflicting. I mean, I gave Grim Coven a 4, so it's definitely a little higher, but there are some things I like a lot better about Dark Blood. But I think the bosses were certainly more interesting in Grim Coven. In any case, then until next time, I'm Alex Radical from Board Game Co. I hope you found this review helpful, and as always, I hope you have a good one.